Okay, Georgia, you get to be in this video. Say hi to the YouTubers. All right, this video is going to be a tutorial on mountain bike maintenance. It's going to be an overview of when to do certain types of maintenance on your mountain bike. I know a lot of you all out there will buy a mountain bike and put a couple G's into a really nice mountain bike, and then you wonder, well, what am I supposed to do to take care of my investment? So I'm not going to go into really detailed instruction of how to do some of the things that I'll mention in this video. This is more of an overview talking about the timeline of when you should do maintenance and what type of maintenance you should do. I'll also give some tips and tricks of things you can do to take care of your mountain bike. Let's start with what you should do before every ride, and that is checking the air pressure and also lubing your chain. So before I head out, I just lean my bike up against the garage like so, and I put air in the tires. Now, even though this pump has a gauge on it, I recommend getting a pressure gauge that you can carry with you in your bag. That way, no matter what pump you use, you're going to have a consistent tire pressure. Because I have two of these exact same Giant pumps, and I say Giant, it's made by Giant, that I won at some races. They both read a little bit different on the gauge, even though they're the same pump. So I always recommend checking your tire pressure with a digital pressure gauge. And this one reads 26 pounds. Now, as another tip, always just squeeze the tire so you can get a feel after you get your reading on your pressure gauge. That way, after you do this a few dozen times, you'll pretty much get a good feel of what that pressure feels like. That way, if you ever get a flat on the trail and you got to use just a hand pump, you'll get a pretty good idea of what your pressure needs to be. And then I lube my chain about every 2 hours of riding. So if I haven't ridden in a while, I'll just hold the lube over the chain, spin it backwards, drip, I don't know, maybe about 5 seconds, just enough to get the chain twice. So it goes around twice while you're spinning the pedal backwards, and that will lube the chain. So if I've ridden the day before and my ride was only an hour and I lube the chain, I won't do it the next day. But again, if it's been a couple hours since I've lubed the chain, I just use a drip lube and put it on the chain. I don't do every single individual link with one drop. That's just too time consuming for me to do. But by keeping lube on your chain, you're going to make it last longer. And also, I recommend periodically, and you don't have to do this every ride, but just check your quick releases, whether it's a mountain bike, road bike, whatever. My back one comes loose about every, 5 hours of riding. It's a through axle threaded, but I just find that it comes loose. So it's a really good safety tip just to check those. Again, not every ride, but do it once a week or so. And then I recommend at least once a month to just hook up a shock pump to your suspension and check your pressures, just to make sure you don't have a leak in your fork, or if you have a rear shock in your rear shock. If the seals are holding well, you should be able to go months and months without having to add air. But this is a good way to check for a leak. And obviously, if you feel like your suspension is getting soft, go ahead and check it. And as a tip, make sure you write down your pressures, and that way, whether it's air pressure in your tires or air pressure in your shocks, write them down so that you will know what they feel like, and when you make adjustments, you'll know where to go, either up or down, and how that feels. If you're running tires as tubeless, you're going to have some sealant inside, and this stuff I found for my conditions dries up about every 3 months. So that's going to vary on where you ride, on your humidity and things like that. So I recommend about every 3 months actually opening up your tires and probably adding some more fluid, and also checking for those rubber balls that form inside. And I have a separate video that shows how to do that, how to do just a quick addition of fluid to your tires. Now let's talk about keeping your bike clean. I have a separate video that goes into pretty detailed instructions of how to clean a bike in about 15 minutes. But you want to keep your bike fairly clean. So if you ride in a mud ride, if it's raining or muddy, you're going to want to clean your bike right after that ride. Sometimes I can go for a month without having to clean my bike. Now the drivetrain is the part that you want to focus most on keeping it clean. You want to go no more than 20 hours of riding before you do a clean on your drivetrain, and that is cleaning the chain, cleaning the cogs, and cleaning your chain rings. And again, I showed that in my my tutorial on how to clean a bike. Now let me talk about one way to really keep your drivetrain working well, and that is checking the tension, or the stretch, I mean, of your chain. This little guy is a must. Some tool to check your chain. Now you can use a tape measure. It's not something that I could recommend. I can check my chain in about 3 seconds with this Park chain checker. This is a Park CC2 is the model number. And this is something that you really need to do, and you need to check your chain, I'd say every couple weeks, and see if it's stretching. Because if a chain gets stretched out, not only do you risk it breaking on a ride, but you're going to wear out your drivetrain, and if you go too long with the stretched chain, it's going to wear your cogs and your chain ring, and you would have to change those too. Usually it wears the rear cog first, and then it'll eventually stretch out your chain ring, and that's an expensive replacement, to replace your chain rings and cassette all at the same time. Let me show you real quick how this is used. So the chain checker has a fat pin and a skinny pin, and the fat one goes between the fat portion of the link and the skinny portion between the skinny portion. And you just put it in there, press it down, and then it'll give you a little bit of a reading here. And this says 0.25. So this chain has not stretched at all. This is a KMC chain. I'll just throw in, I am really impressed with how long this chain is lasting. I've never had a chain go this long. Sometimes, you know, you might be changing your chain out every 3 months. But to keep your drivetrain working well and from stretching out your cassette and your chain ring, I think it's very well worth it. Now once mine gets to about the little over 0.5, coming up to 0.75, I will change it. I do not let it go past 0.75. If you do that, you will be stretching out your cassette, and you'll know you've done that if you get on the bike and you pedal hard in a gear that you use a lot. It's going to skip, and that can be very dangerous. I actually had a buddy on a road ride in a sprint, and he was sprinting and his cassette skipped because he had put on a new chain, and he had a really bad crash. Again, this is one of the most important maintenance things you can do, just keeping your chain from getting too stretched out. Now let's talk about brake maintenance. Today's modern sealed disc brake systems require very little maintenance. The pads are the things that you need to pay attention to the most. And it's kind of hard to see in the video here, but these pads still are pretty thick. And just what you want to do is you want to just look at them maybe every couple weeks and just make sure they're not getting too thin. And if they get too thin, it's obviously time to replace. You do not want to get to where the pads have worn completely out and you're having that metal behind the pad rubbing your rotor. Now what you want to do is, if you're making a trip somewhere to the mountains, or you're going to be having a long descent, it's a good idea to go ahead and change them if they're starting to get too thin, because if you ever get caught in a wet downhill, you can go through a set of brake pads in one descent. I've done a downhill in the rain, a long downhill, and a fairly new set of pads were completely shot by the end of the downhill. And then there's been times when I've ridden just mainly in dry conditions, and I've had brake pads last a year. So it's really dependent on your conditions. Now, I'm not going to go into much detail of brakes, but let me just say that I know most of y'all know this, but there are two different kinds of brake pads mainly. The metal ones, which are also called centered, or resin pads. And the metal ones will last longer. Some of the downsides of metal pads are that they are noisier, and they don't have that initial bite that a resin pad, and I don't think they have as good of a feel, so not quite as good modulation, but they fade at a higher temperature, and they do last longer. If pad wear is not an issue, and you're not doing wet descents and long descents, then I would recommend resin pads. I just feel like they have a better feel. As far as the fluid in the brake lines, You only really need to bleed your brakes if the lever starts to feel spongy. So when it gets to that point where it grabs, if it feels soft from that point on, then it's time to do a brake bleed. And I show how to do that in a separate video, so I won't go into detail. But you know, these systems are sealed, so they can go a long time without maintenance. You probably want to replace the brake fluid about every, I'd say, 2 years, or if it starts to get discolored. So maybe once a year, if your brakes are still performing fine. If it's a system where you can undo the cap and check the color of the fluid, if it's not getting discolored, you're still good. I mean, these things go for a long time. But after a couple years, you probably just want to flush the system, either with a syringe or using gravity to let, you know, a funnel and gravity, just letting the brake fluid flow through the lines, and just replace that brake fluid, whether it's mineral oil or DOT fluid. Let's talk now about suspension maintenance. Fox recommends on their suspension changing the oil every 30 hours of riding. I typically will go about every 50 hours because the conditions I ride in aren't that harsh. Now for the rear shock, they call it air sleeve maintenance, and it's really just a matter of unscrewing this air sleeve and you know, cleaning everything off and putting the right amount of fluid back in. And again, I have a video that shows how to do that. Rock shocks is going to be the same way. I don't know what their schedule is, so just check your manual for your suspension. Same thing with the front. It's really just a matter of changing the oil. And if you're not real mechanically inclined, you know, you can just take it to the bike shop and have them do it. But it's a good way to just keep your suspension working well. That's probably one of the most hassles, I would say, of mountain bikes, is actually keeping up with the oil change. Now, I've known guys that have gone for 2 years without changing the oil in their forks. The performance probably is going to degrade a little bit, but if you're not running just, you know, dry suspension, in other words, you don't have a leak, then, you know, you could go a long time. But it's my recommendation to get the best performance that you just go with the manufacturer's recommendation. Now, Fox also recommends a full service, which I don't do myself. I will send my suspension in about once a year. I'll send my cross-country fork and shock into Fox to do their full service. My trail bike doesn't get as many hours of riding, and I go about 1.5 years before I send those back into Fox. If you are running a full suspension bike, you've got pivots, and today's modern bikes require very little maintenance. I've had really good success with Giant, Turner, and other modern designs that really just don't require a whole lot. You can drip some lube if you don't have carbon links or any carbon that the lube is going to get into. You can drip some lube in here. You don't want to go too much on it because too much lube will attract dirt. So if you do put some lube in your pivots, take a paper towel with some rubbing alcohol and then wipe all around it to make sure you get that excess out before you start riding, because it can attract dirt. So I would just recommend checking what your bike manufacturer recommends as far as pivot maintenance. Some pivots, for like example Turner, have bushings, and they have little ports that you can inject grease in. It's a really neat design. I think Santa Cruz does the same thing. So just go according to their recommendation on that. The bearings, you know, after a long period of time will wear out. I don't change out my bearings unless they start to feel crunchy. And what you can do is put the bike in a work stand, take the rear wheel out, undo one of these shock bolts, and then just by hand move the suspension up and down. If it feels very smooth, then you're good to go. You can also kind of put your hand over the pivots as you move it and see if any one of them feel crunchy, or if you hear any crunching sound inside the pivots. Then it's time to change out the pivots. And that is a service that I would recommend your shop doing, unless you have the right tools and you really need a bearing press if they're bearings. or you know, if they're bushings, there's different ways that you can take those out. That again, that's something that really I only do once they need it. Another component on your bike that's going to need some periodic maintenance is your derailleur cables. Now, I will run full housing. In other words, this black outer housing goes all the way from the shifter through the frame all the way back to the derailleur. And that way it keeps dirt out and really cuts down on the maintenance that I do. If you have split housing, I'm going to show you here in a second how you can lube that. And that's something that I recommend doing probably about every 2 months, just putting a little bit of lube. And it's very simple to do if you have split housing. If you have full housing, probably once a year you're going to want to replace the inner wire. And again, I have a video that shows you how to do that. You can go longer than replacing that. It's just something that if you're doing events, you know, races or any kind of event where you pay money to ride, you don't want to break a derailleur cable in the middle of the event if it's been a while since you replaced it. And that has happened to me before. And if it breaks, it usually breaks up here. There's a little tip where the derailleur cable goes into the shifter, and that can break up there after a long period of use. So again, something that I recommend doing about every year, you know, every 2 years if you don't ride all that often. As far as the housing, it's probably a good idea to replace the housing as well when you're replacing that inner wire. It's not near as crucial. The housing really won't break. It's just if you replace that inner wire and the performance of your shifting hasn't improved, it's still kind of hard to push your shifter, then you probably want to change out the housing as well. So if you have a split housing design like this bike has, this is my wife's bike, you can lube the cable very easily by shifting into, if it's the rear cable, shifting into your biggest cog in the back, or if it's the front derailleur, your biggest chain ring. And then what you want to do, without spinning the pedals at all, is just shift all the way down, and that's going to loosen up the cable. And then you can pull it out and put some lube on it. And when you're shifting to take tension off your cable, it's probably going to be a good idea to pull out on the cable. That way you can shift all the way down to where it's really loose. And then all you're going to do is pull the housing out. Sometimes you might have to take a pair of needle nose pliers and just pull these end caps out. And then you've got the housing to where it can just pull down, and you'll want to take some lube and just drip some on your fingers and then just run it along the inner wire there and just put it back in. And that's a real good way to quickly lube your inner wire for bikes that have split housing. And like I said, probably something you want to do every 2-3 months just to keep your shifting going really well. And of course, when you're done, make sure you shift it back up all the way. And I can't really see that in the video, but I'm just shifting it back up, and then spin the pedals. And this one has split housing in the back, so I'll do the same thing for the back as well. And I've got to loosen up the tension to do that. As far as your tires, really it's just a matter of replacing them when they get worn. So when your knobs, especially in the middle, that's where they're going to wear the most, get worn down, it's time to replace them. Now tires, after about a year, they start to lose their elasticity and they get hard and they don't grip as well. So if you're real particular about how your bike rides and the way it feels in corners and things like that, even if they don't get worn, after a year and a half, you're probably going to want to change out the tires. And also inspect your tires every once in a while for cracks on the sidewalls. So if you start to see places that where they get cracked, that's a place where you could have a failure in your tire. And that also happens if you tear your sidewall on a rock. Sometimes you can catch it on a rock and it won't actually puncture right then, but it will weaken the sidewall. So just inspect your tires and replace them when they're worn, and every year, year and a half, you probably want to just put on a new set of tires. Another item that's going to require some maintenance are bearings in your hub, in your bottom bracket, and your headset. And these are items that I only maintain when they start to degrade. So if you get some noises, some crunching noises or friction in your hubs, and you know, if you take the wheel out of your bike, just put your finger inside the hub, spin it around. If it's smooth, you're good to go. I don't change out bearings again unless there starts to be a problem. You know, these new modern hubs are awesome because they have sealed bearings, and you just tap them out, use a bearing press to put them back in, and you're fine. If you've been riding bikes for a long time, you'll remember free bearings and hubs where you actually had to take the hubs apart, lube up the bearings, and put them back in. And I do that probably once a year on my bikes. But new sealed bearings are great. When the bearings start to go, you just tap them out and put in some new ones. Pretty much the same for the bottom bracket. You know, bottom brackets can go a couple years if you're not riding in real harsh conditions before you have to replace the bearings. So again, the main bearings that you're going to have, other than suspension pivots, are your hubs, your bottom bracket, and your headset, and just maintain those when the performance starts to degrade. So that'll do it for what I call your routine maintenance and best practice in taking care of your mountain bike. And these tips can also be used for a road bike as well in many applications. Now you'll probably get a manual that comes with your bike that tells you things that you can do. But the stuff that I've shown in this video are things that I've found useful after, I've been riding mountain bikes for 20 years. So I've got some pretty good experience as far as maintenance. So these are some things that I've learned that I wanted to share with you. Now let me wrap up this video by talking about something that all of us have experienced if we've been riding mountain bikes for a while, and that is creaking noises that can rise in your bike. And they're very frustrating because a lot of times they're hard to find. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some common things on your bike that can cause creaking noises and how to resolve those. The most common thing that causes creaking noises on a bike, especially if you have an aluminum frame, is the seat post. And there have been times where it's creaked and I thought it was something else, but always start with the seat post if you have a creaking noise. And one way that you can kind of determine that is just to kind of bounce up and down on the saddle when you're not pedaling. And if it's still creaking, then it's probably the seat post. The way that you remedy that is pull the seat post out, just take your Allen wrench and pull it out. The thing that I found works best, and it works even better than grease, is WD-40. This is probably one of the only applications that I would use WD-40 on a bike. It does not make a good lube, but it does a really good job of solving a creaking noise. Now, if you have a carbon frame, do not use WD-40. Use something like this carbon gel that's safe for putting on carbon. And that goes too if you have a carbon seat post. Don't use WD-40. Only use WD-40 if you have an aluminum seat post and aluminum frame. If the bike still creaks after doing that, and especially if it creaks when you're bouncing up and down on the saddle, it may be your saddle rails. So what you can do is take the saddle out, clean everything off real good, and put some grease or WD-40, but grease will last longer on the saddle rails, and put it back together and see if that works. If that doesn't work, then you can get some creaking noises from the bottom bracket. And if you have a threaded bottom bracket, first just make sure that's tight. A lot of times if you're cranking hard and you get a creaking noise, it's typically the bottom bracket, and you'll want to make sure your threaded bottom bracket is tight. Now if you still get noises coming from the bottom bracket area, and again you can diagnose that by just pedaling hard, then you may have to take out your bottom bracket and just put some grease on the threads and put it back in. Another area that can cause noises is your cassette and the way it interfaces with the hub body. So the first thing that you want to do, if you've tried the other things, and actually I recommend trying this in the drivetrain before the bottom bracket, because this is pretty easy, and that is just tighten this lock ring, make sure it's tight on the cassette. If that doesn't work, you can pull the cassette off, clean off the freewheel body real good, put some WD-40 on it, and just kind of wipe it off, don't have too much, and then put the cassette back on and make sure the lock ring is as tight as it should be, and hopefully that'll solve your creaking noises coming from the cassette area. Sometimes you can get some creaking noises coming from the suspension, and really just stop pedaling, bounce on the bike out of the saddle, and if it's making some creaking noises, then a lot of times it is the suspension pivots, and I talked before about lubing the pivot, so you need to do that. The final thing I'll mention for creaking noises is the headset. And there are times when I get some creaking noises from the headset, and you would really think it's another part of the bike, but it's actually the headset. So all you would do there is drop the fork out, just take the bearings and clean them off real good, put some grease on them, put everything back together, and hopefully that'll solve the problem with the creaking headset. So that will conclude this video on bike maintenance. Hopefully I've given you some tips that are going to help you keep your investment running well and lasting a long time. Thanks for watching.